Hi, everybody. Welcome to North Brooklyn DSA Night School. Tonight's session is on social movements and class struggle, and we're so pleased to have Rachel Himes joining us to give a bit of a talk, after which we'll go to Q&A and discussion. But first, a word about why we're here. We do political education to strengthen our activism. In studying social movements, reading history and theory, we can learn from our predecessors and fellow activists, both what works and what's less effective. We can strengthen our critical thinking skills, sharpen our analysis, better understand what we're up against in the struggle, and form better strategies accordingly. So we thank you for being here, and as much as we learn from text, we also learn from each other. So I hope you'll be happy to engage in discussion with us. And with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome Rachel Himes as our facilitator tonight. Rachel is a member of Central Brooklyn DSA and a graduate student at Columbia, and an all-around good comrade. She spoke for us last year on this subject, and we all got so much out of it, we invited her back this year. So with that, I'd like to introduce Rachel. Thanks.
Hey, good evening, everyone. It's nice to be joining North Brooklyn. I'm a Central Brooklyn member, and I do want to say I'm sorry that we're not meeting in person. I think it's my fault because I live in Crown Heights, so not close to Mayday Space, and I have a 6 a.m. flight tomorrow to visit my mother because it is her birthday. So I think that's on me, but I hope we have a good time together this evening nevertheless. As Carrington has said, our focus this evening is on social movements. And I think these social movements are some of the most challenging things that we as organizers on the left have to strategize around, organize around, and nevertheless, I think we have to, take them into account in our thinking and our organizing. Social movements are, by definition, massive, large, and that makes them unwieldy, unpredictable. They draw people in from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of political orientations, from anarchist to liberal, and all kinds of different organizations get sucked into them. And DSA is just one of the organizations that is trying to develop orientations to social movements. And I hope we can develop a good orientation to them so they can play an important role in our organizing. But this is to say, a lot of different political orientations can be present in a mass movement. If a movement is dominated by any single organization, has any particular ownership, then it's not going to be a mass movement. That's antithetical to the definition. And I think what is true for a lot of organizers, myself included, is that people often get their first exposure to not just left politics, but really any kind of politics, any kind of political organizing activity through a mass movement, through a protest. For me, that were the protests against the Iraq War during Bush's second term. When I was living in Washington, D.C., and there were every week, sometimes every day during the week, these massive anti-war protests. So we know, obviously, from personal experience, from historical record, that mass movements are a catalyzing force, and we want to acknowledge also they have potential to be an organizing force in the broader class struggle. They are a source of actual power for us, but I think also a source of potential power to make moves and win gains for the left. So we've lived through, I think, a number of significant movements. These have the power to set political agendas, like the anti-war movement I just mentioned, to occupy Wall Street, to both of the waves of the Black Lives Matter movement. Those are the major movements over the past 15 years. And I think the question for us as leftists is, what is setting the terms for the movements of our generation? What is defining them? What is the terrain in which they operate? And how are they similar to, and how are they different from, I think, the definitive American movement, the civil rights movement? And I think it's interesting for us as leftists to look back towards the history of the civil rights movement and try to take lessons from it. I think when we engage with that history from an academic perspective or from even a patriotic perspective, there's this kind of effect where it becomes hermetically sealed, and it's like, everything everyone did then was perfect, and there was like a clear trajectory towards, victory, towards civil rights. But we can of course look at those histories and see like what can we take away, what went well, what didn't go so well. So we have a different, I think, relationship as leftists to the history of the civil rights movement. And those are some of the questions we'll be thinking about today. And I do want to note today, like when I give my presentation, I'll be talking mostly about American movements of the past, of the recent past and of the historic past, not just because those are the only important ones. Obviously, they're not the only important ones, but that's just what I know about. So if you have knowledge of or experience with social movements, protest movements elsewhere in the world, I hope you will share it in our discussion. So I think when we first gathered to discuss this topic last year, and I think this still holds true today, our impetus for thinking about the significance of protest movements was, of course, the second wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, the George Floyd uprising of summer 2020. Those were the largest protests in United States history, with between 15 and 25 million people participating in some form of demonstration across the country. And those protests took a variety of shapes, variety of tactics: rioting, looting, marching, workplace actions, job stoppages, port shutdowns. And we're living in the wake of those protests now. We are reckoning with the demands that emerged from those protests, particularly the demand to defund the police. And we are also living in the moment of an ideological, I think, backlash to the demands that came out of those protests. We saw Republican candidates outperform expectations in recent elections, despite Biden's significant victory. We saw aggressive attack ads that played to the fears about riots, the dangers associated with supposedly defunding the police. Closer to home, even, we saw attempts to channel this backlash into attacks on our NYC DSA endorsed candidates during the 2021 election cycle. Almost all of them who were running for city council were targets of mailers claiming that their policies, including the redirection of NYPD funding, would increase crime and make neighborhoods more dangerous. So that's a backlash. It's a repercussion of the George Floyd uprising and the demands that came out of it. And I think it's really interesting to think about the different impacts of the two waves of the Black Lives Matter movement on our, or rather just the first wave, on our electoral work at NYC. In summer 2020, we saw sweeping victory in our state races with a slate sweep. In 2021, further from that movement, people starting to reckon with the demands that emerged out of it, we did not do as well. And I'm not saying that we should have not integrated demands from the George Floyd uprising into our candidates' platform, but it's worth considering what are the various ways in which protest movements can impact our work in other arenas, including electoral. We saw two very different outcomes. Both, I think, were related to the George Floyd uprising and then its sort of aftermath and the organizing that came out of it. A lot has happened since that uprising, since the summer of 2020, but it's always important for us to reflect on social movements and how an organized left should relate to them so we can be ready for the next one. So the questions that I think is worth engaging with as organizers, as DSA members, as leftists is, where do movements come from? What conditions do they take place under? How do they relate to their contexts? What tactics do they use? What kind of power do they exercise? What kind of power don't they or can't they exercise? And then what is the role of left organizations in a social movement? So these are some of the questions we can be contending with tonight, drawing inspiration from the civil rights movement, but also from the more recent social movements that have happened in more recent American history. I think it's worth beginning at the beginning, where do social movements come from? We've seen most recently an event serve as a catalyst. So the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department, that was a catalyst So too was the not guilty verdict of the officer who beat Rodney King, the LAPD officer, sparking off riots in LA. But while these events can be catalysts, they aren't happening in a vacuum. In both cases, the surrounding context were decades of police violence, harassment, and I think the even broader context were sky-high unemployment rates nearing 50% in LA. And then in summer 2020, we had the broader context of COVID-19, with people losing their jobs, losing their homes. And at that time, we had seen an extremely weak and limited response from the federal, city, and state governments. But that's not the only way that protests can get started. I think Occupy Wall Street had a really different situation, actually. I actually think it's really surprising that movement, which was massive nationwide, began with a call to protest from ad busters. They said, we're protesting at the state at this time. And I feel like usually that doesn't work, but this time it did. And the larger context of those movements were the debt and foreclosure crises caused by the Great Recession. So I think in each of these cases, we see there's disinvestment, austerity, financial crisis that is having effects that trickle down to communities, that is precipitating these large and massive backlashes. And I think there's a quote from Rosa Luxemburg that I really love on this point, because I think it's actually kind of funny. She says, the mass strike is not artificially made. It's not decided out of the blue. There's not it's not as if someone can go house to house peddling the idea of the mass strike. She says mass strike, but I think it works for mass movement as well. She says we can't go house to house peddling the idea in order to win the working class to it. Basically, just the working class has to be brought to it through their own experience, through the experience of deprivation and crisis. And I think that is true. And I think remaining aware of those contexts help us see what forms mass movements might take when they do emerge. So there's this idea of spontaneity, that the mass movement springs into life. People are reacting organically to their conditions. But I think a second point of consideration actually diverges from the way that I think we are accustomed to thinking about protest movements today. I think if we look at American social movements, and especially the civil rights movement, we see the way in which they are, which their expressions of protest are intentionally patterned on and are intentionally reacting to the extant structures in our society, taking into account the arenas in which pressure can be applied, taking into account the actors that can grant demands. I think some conventional, maybe liberal thinking, or even some forms of left thinking on protest movements see them as operating in spaces outside of sort of hegemonic political and economic power. And I believe that protests can be or are expressions of this sort of spontaneous rage, outpourings of rage, of dissatisfaction. But I also believe at the same time, people participating in protests are motivated by the idea that they are some path to meaningful change, that they offer some form of redress, that they are a road to possibility for meaningful change. And I think that meaningful change necessarily needs to happen. I think it can only happen within certain structures, systems in the society we live in. So I think our role as organizers is to identify how does the spontaneous uprising, outpouring of political expression on the part of the masses relate to this path to what victory looks like for the left, to the concessions that we demand from the state. How do we reconcile these two pathways? And I think they're not actually that separate as some people might claim. People, I think, are really fond of counterposing sort of spontaneous mass expression to electoral politics or to pressure campaigns. And I really think they exist in the same and identical universe and depend on each other in important ways. So because the question, how do structural conditions inform social movements? How do they shape social movements? How do they structure the horizon of possibility for what we can gain from social movements? Frances Fox Piven, who was in the readings for today, I know Some of you might not have gotten to them, but we'll talk about it, so that's very good. One way to sort of answer this question of how structural conditions relate to social movements is through Frances Fox Piven's concept of disruptive power. She argues that power is distributed unequally, but still distributed throughout society, across classes, across individuals, across groups. And she says that disruption is the activation of power within this interdependent, interlocking system. And she says that disruption often happens through the withdrawal of cooperation or participation in systems, the refusal to go about business as usual. So everyone holds power as an individual, as a group. These powers are networked together. And when a party, an agent, withdraws power, that's a disruption to the system. And I think, probably the clearest, most straightforward example of this are strikes. Workers are refusing to cooperate, they're withdrawing their labor. This creates a crisis for owners, for managers. That is the power that they have, disrupting. I'm actually on strike right now. So I'm exercising my disruptive power. I've been on strike for about 6 weeks with the Student Workers of Columbia, UAW 2110. So this is feeling very close to home right now. We're hoping that we have sufficient disruptive power to win our first contract, but it's been a long strike. Another clear example, a rent strike, tenants refusing to pay. These are examples of people recognizing the power they have, withholding their cooperation, and thereby causing disruption. And I think the thing about protests is they actually aren't necessarily or inherently disruptive. You can have protests that don't exercise disruptive power, but I think protests have a very high potential to disrupt. Looking for a historic example of disruptive power, we can consider, for example, the sustained blockage of business in downtown Birmingham in 1963. Organizers were able to create a crisis for business owners during the boycott in Birmingham. Retailers lost an average of $750 a week in the currency of the 1960s, which is a significant sum of money. And so after 5 weeks of the boycott, it was business leaders who put pressure on local government to concede to the organizers' demands, which were to desegregate public spaces. So that was a victory. They disrupted commerce, business as usual. But what is key, Frances Fox Piven would argue, to the exercise of disruptive power is recognizing which relationships, which social, economic, political, which relationships actors are enmeshed in. These structure the disruptive possibilities that are open to them. Not everyone can exercise every form of disruptive power. So you have to recognize the systems in which we're intermeshed and exercise power within the arenas to which we belong. A really clear example of, something someone can't do is people who do not have jobs, the unemployed, cannot withhold their labor. They have other forms of disruptive power, but not that one. So I think that that's something to consider. I think, not only are we thinking about which systems, which structures we hold that power in, we're thinking about who else is there with us. During the Vietnam War, students demonstrate in the university context. And it wasn't necessarily the case that the university context was the most significant arena for demonstrating against the Vietnam War. What I think was happening there was students recognized that they had collective bonds in that space. They were united as a group, as a mass in that space, maybe more so than they were elsewhere. And so they were able to move as a mass, as a unit. And so that is something else that structures us. We need to be aware of which factors can unite us in the structures we're enmeshed in, and which factors might disunite us, tear us apart. So how can we act as a collective within the structures we have to operate in? Who else is there? I think it's significant in that Birmingham boycott. Martin Luther King and other organizers chose that location because it was a segregationist stronghold, because there were a lot segregationists in power in the business sector and in holding office. And so there was a potential for backlash, and recognizing the potential of that backlash became an important strategic question. They wanted to incite the backlash that was critical to the strategy of nonviolence. So I think that, overall, we understand the rules that govern structural relationships in order to strategically defy them. And that's, I think, what Francis Fox Piven is really getting at, whether those are legal rules, contractual rules, social cultural rules, property rights, labor relations. These are things these are relations we want to defy, and that's the exercise of disruptive power. And some of these relationships will be more strategic than others as contexts in which to leverage that power. I think that this idea of specificity, of context, of the situation in which we find ourselves also extends to the tactics that we use. Tactics also reflect these conditions. And we can actually look at the civil rights movement for an example of a great diversity of tactics. They did many different types of action to different ends, responding to different contexts and conditions. So it was critical to organizing then to disrupt business, not only on a local scale, not just in Birmingham, but on a macro scale. Sustained protest in the South eventually, over the course of several years, made Northern industry skeptical of investing in Southern growth. This slowed economic investment in the region. Southern business leaders and politicians become aware of this. They are then more interested in the concessions that the civil rights movement was demanding. I think another significant relationship that informed a tactic in the civil rights movement was that leaders, organizers, knew that bringing in federal intervention, forcing federal intervention by creating crises that would necessitate intervention by the National Guard or intervention by executive order or judicial proceedings, Supreme Court proceedings. This was essential to win demand. So scaling up the context from local to the national. Creating the necessity of federal intervention. But I think something that I find really interesting is that eventually civil rights movement organizers start to realize that tactic will no longer be effective. And that's one of the reasons that the main period of gains during the civil rights movement draws to a close. In her book, Keeanga Yamada Taylor cites James Forman, who is the executive director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who said in 1964 that the contradiction between the state and the federal government was played out. And what he was referring to was that the Democratic Party had, through making those concessions, through granting the demands of the civil rights protesters, had secured an electoral base with Black voters in the South. And so the Democratic Party in power felt that they didn't need to give any more ground. So they were no longer interested in sending in the National Guard, in doing executive interventions, in intervening in these struggles on behalf of Black communities. And so I think that really shows an awareness that, the tactic of forcing federal intervention wasn't going to work anymore. And so a reassessment was in order. Other examples of, I think, tactics in the civil rights movement that take condition, context, structure into account is that, for example, the early victories of the civil rights movement were won almost entirely through targeted action with specific demands. Organizers affiliated with SNCC, with CORE, were deciding what kinds of disruptive action to take. One of these forms was the Freedom Rides of 1961. These were a core tactic, Congress for Racial Equality, to target segregated bus and train terminals because they were under federal jurisdiction. So again, they're fighting for a federal order of desegregation of these facilities. And I think that these smaller actions were in the interest of scaling up to more large scale mass marches. So, moving from these smaller attacks to these larger mobilizations. And I think this looks actually really different than the two waves of Black Lives Matter protests that we experienced in recent history. Those really began with a mass movement, with a massive mobilization. And they also began with broad demands rather than these specific targeted interventions, desegregate the public space in this city, desegregate train and bus terminals. So they began with broad demands rather than these targeted requests that were won through civil disobedience. I think one other important lesson to learn from the civil rights movement is that I think at almost all the points, the actions that were especially successful took into account which actors had the power to make a concession. And we're interested in creating situations in which it was in the best interests of those actors to make the concession, trying to force their hand, to give them no other choice than to meet the demands of organizers in the civil rights movement. I think one of the most sort of beautiful narratives of the civil rights movement, in my opinion, is the work of A. Philip Randolph, who is really one of the foremost Black labor organizers in that moment. Randolph spends over a decade organizing Black workers in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the workers who carry people's bags on and off trains and provide their services on railway cars. He spent a long time building the power to organize the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters from scratch in the face of enormous opposition from the Black community. And once he had built that power over the course of a decade, he was able to deploy it to demand the integration of federal jobs. He held the threat of a 10,000 man strong march on Washington, and he took that threat to the federal government, to the president, and with that threat in hand, he was able to win federal jobs for Black people. And ever since then, Black people have been disproportionately helped by federal employment. They are one of the most reliable pathways to economic security for the Black community. So that was a tactic that looked at who has potential power, railway porters, unorganized, and who could be organized, and who has the power to grant the demand. It was through federal intervention that government jobs were desegregated. So a long time coming, but a really powerful victory, one really informed by these system structures, awareness of who holds power and who can grant the demand. So I think the big takeaway here is that we have to think about what kinds of pressure can we apply in the interrelating systems in which we operate. But I will say, obviously we're not in the 1960s anymore. Things have changed. I think that the state has become more effective at limiting the disruptive potential of protests. Not only are we in a moment of a weakened labor movement, although I believe it is, it's doing a lot better now than it was a decade ago. We have police forces that are much more prepared to break up protests by responding with militarized violence. When we think about other relationships in which we're enmeshed, I think it's much harder to disrupt commerce, which is such an important tactic in the civil rights movement. It's much harder now in this time of global capital and mega retailers like Amazon. And so we have a different terrain, certainly, than the civil rights movement. And I think maybe more powerful forces arrayed against us, who, of course, do not want to concede to our demands, who want to do everything they can to diminish the disruptive power of the movement, to subvert it, to redirect it. During the civil rights movement, for example, the Kennedy administration wanted to stop SNCC, SCLC, CORE, wanted to stop these racial justice organizations from direct confrontation in the fight to desegregation, wanted to shift their focus to participation in electoral politics. So the Attorney General, meets with the leaders of these organizations to pledge their support for voter registration drives in the South. They say, we'll support you in this if you stop, the direct confrontations, which are ending in violence, which are making, them look really bad globally. But this, I think, it's kind of ironic, this diversion to electoral politics actually backfires because white Southerners react with extreme violence to the attempt to register Black voters in the South. So it actually ends up creating more opportunities for the direct confrontation that was winning gains during the civil rights movement. And there were extreme violence met with these voter registration campaigns in the South. But that, I think, is an example of redirection. And as left organizers want to see those attempts to redirect coming and think about how to resist them. The tendency of the state, of businesses, of institutions, even of some nonprofits, is to let the protest play out, or even to attempt to co-opt it, attempt to uplift it in their own statements, in their own actions, and thereby inhibit the possibility for actual disruption. And I think we're well beyond this, but I think as left organizers, as DSA members, but I think there still is the danger of seeing these kind of concessions as meaningful victories when they're really just posturing, and when they're really lip service. And I think one of the most powerful tools we have in the fight against co-optation, against redirection, is organization. I think organized groups, like DSA, can help shape the politics, can help shape the demands, can help us resist co-optation, fragmentation, dissolution, disenchantment that come when we get moral concessions, but not material concessions, or when we see people in power uplifting, supporting the movement, but then in the end doing very little to make any material advances. So I think this brings me to one of the most interesting questions, I think, for us, which is what is the role of organizations, of our organizations in movements? How should we relate to them? And this is a question we were actively asking ourselves during the George Floyd uprising. I remember discussions about, should we be handing out literature? Should we have the DSA flags out? Should we be calling our own protests if we see nothing has been planned? Should we be working in coalition? Like, what can we do as an organization? I think a lot of people felt, there's something critical we have to offer. In New York City, we have 7,000 members who we can activate in the space of the movement, but what exactly do we do? And of course, one of the ways that we, I think, not during the uprising, but immediately after, was by running a slate of city council candidates who were centering defunding the NYPD as a demand. That was, I think, an enormous contribution on the part of our organization to that social movement, to this social movement, since we're still in it. But in discourse, movements are often, as I said at the beginning, counterposed to organizations and even to organizing. This is something that Frances Fox Piven talks about a lot. In the first Black Lives Matter uprising, for example, a lot of people were celebrating. There was a lot of celebration of the horizontal, decentralized, and I think, deorganized nature of the protests. It was sort of characterized as a leaderless movement where the collective of the people was the source of power. And attempts to lead from the top were highly criticized, although I think now we do see a couple people who have stepped up and sort of claimed ownership of Black Lives Matter as an organization, and I actually don't think it's going very well. And of course, it was never going to be the case that one leader or one organization could have called or brought about that uprising. It was more of a spontaneous expression and reaction to a catalyst. So social movements, they don't necessarily begin with clear leaders or definite demands, but those can emerge out of them, and those have an important role to play in them. They have an essential role to play. I think social movements are a hold enormous power, and we have to think. I think it's part of the role of the organization to actually channel that power into directions that build and strengthen the movement, rather than allowing it to dissipate and fizzle away when no concessions are made, or when it seems like there's no path forward. A concept that I think Keeanga Yamada Taylor talks about that feels really important to me in this context is sort of the tyranny of structurelessness. How even though there's this celebration of the spontaneity, the horizontality, the leaderlessness, I think it is the case, and I hope as members of DSA you would agree that it is actually durable democratic organizations with clear and accountable leadership, with ways for people to get easily involved, that keep movements alive, keep them churning, keep them being productive, rather than fizzling away and dissipating. And I think this is something we see the role of a socialist organization. For example, in LeBlanc's article on the freedom budget, the Socialist Party was really instrumental in organizing the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, together with Black socialist leaders like Randolph. And they really were able to set a tone in pushing for economic and class-wide demands. And so I think that's really our role, to make those kind of interventions, to shape demands, to create winnable demands, to recognize the terrain in which they are winnable, the actors who can be pressured, who have the power to grant them. And I think that, we are really living in this moment of movements, mass mobilization, Black Lives Matter, big uprisings. This is what politics is to people now, which is incredible. And I think the question that we're engaging with is, how do we interface with that, and where do we go from there? What do we contribute to this moment of movements? So that pretty much wraps up everything I wanted to say. I know I just talked for a while, so I'm hoping to hear from other folks now. And I think we're gonna move into, I guess, discussion. But yeah, that wraps up this part of our time together.
Thank you so much, Rachel. There's so much, you have so much insight into the subject. So we're going to go to Q&A, but first, Obi is going to go over our community agreement. Obi.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Rachel, again, for the great talk. First, we're all here to learn. We're all here to be comradely. If you have a question, please write stack in the chat, and Doug will call on you. Please keep your questions brief, less than 30 seconds, and we should all be good from there. Doug?
Hello, all. And that was a really great talk. Thank you very much for that. And anyone want to ask a question, type stack, and I will call you, and I'll try to exercise a degree of balance in who I call on. Anyone? Well, while we're waiting for someone, I'll ask a question. This is a little bit off topic, but do you have any thoughts on right-wing social movements like the Christian right, the right to lifers, different kinds of organization, influence, relationship to politicians, existing institutions? And is there anything we can learn from them?
That's a good question. I think one thing about right social movements, right organizations, is that I guess I would counterpose them to the left. I think on the left, we're often trying to play to people's material needs. I think their rights to a certain kind of life, the right to healthcare, the right to job protections. I think that what we see in right social movements, organizations, is they're often playing more to like ideological demands, culture demands, which are often quite reactionary, but they are able to capture people's minds and hearts, I think, in a different way than the material demands that we are bringing to movements on the left sometimes. I will say, I think this is, I think one of the things that is so powerful, the Black Lives Matter movement, is because it has this deep emotional charge. It builds upon histories of violent oppression and subjugation. And I think that is why it is able to be so powerful, is because people do have this affective, emotional orientation towards it that leads them to a sense of, what justice would look like. And I think, I don't want to suggest that you manufacture this in other arenas, but I think that is one thing about right social organizations, social movements, that is different, that they often are operating on a more effective ideological terrain. And I don't know if that's a lesson to learn, but I think it is something that maybe distinguishes us from them.
Hey, thank you. Mia, you had something?
Oh, I'm still prepping my question. I think Jay might be before me.
Okay. Jay?
Okay, yeah, just a comment, a question. So great presentation, Rachel. I wanted to go back to your earlier comments on Luxembourg and then OWS. I think that was really effective of analyzing the emergence of OWS as part of a mass strike process. It was kind of a global, you could look at Spain and Greece and Egypt and Tunisia at the same time. So I agree, you can't call them forward, but Piven, or Luxembourg, who Piven is influenced by as well, said that you can help lay the groundwork and push it forward by agreeing on a broad set of demands and kind of an alternative that gets us towards socialism. But that seemed to be the real obstacle in Occupy, that there was this real hostility to any kind of demands, particularly placing them on the state. And contrary to being horizontal, they weren't at all. There were real leaders that were sabotaging any attempt to raise the demands. And it seems like in some ways, I know I only got 30 seconds, I'll wrap it up here quickly, but the weakness of the BLM uprisings was there wasn't really, it was kind of bizarre in many ways that in the midst of the massive unemployment in the summer, there were no economic demands. And in fact, there was hostility to raising any of those, as we saw like in Seattle when Swant tried to introduce them. And that, I think, is some responsibility with the left, including the DSA, without agreeing to a broad set of demands, not one little, Medicare for all, but an alternative program, relentlessly fighting and having elected representatives that are beholden to that program, not just doing anything they want, which is kind of raised by the larger issue raised by the Bowman controversy. So I just wanted to think, if you could reflect, respond to some of those observations.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. That was, we've just passed a significant anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. So there's been a lot of reflecting on, what happened, how it happened, what the repercussions have been. I would say, you talked about how there's this idea of laying the groundwork for a movement, for organizing around demands. And I think now looking back, I think Occupy actually was laying the groundwork. That's not how we would have seen it at the time, I think, at the moment we were like, this is it, like, this is the moment, which like we topple these systems. But I think Occupy, now looking back, did lay the groundwork in a significant way. And I wonder if it would have been able to do that if it had been more programmatic. Maybe it's, hindsight is 2020, but I'm hearing people who, thinking I admire, say that the importance of Occupy was its sort of all-encompassing critique, and how that laid the groundwork for then more targeted interventions into it. It was like, like the whole system is fucked, and now we're like, here are the ways in which it is a problem. I do think that, thinking about the question of demands again in the space of both of the waves of Black Lives Matter, I think one thing I would chart between these movements is that they actually had a really different orientation to demands. I would say the first time around, it was extremely unclear what the outcome would be. There were calls for justice. To some people that looked like legal justice. Other people were calling for, police reforms, different kinds of progressive policing, community policing, restrictions on the types of militarized equipment they can use, but it was all over the place. And I think that was why, the movement did kind of become, co-opted by figures like Obama and kind of fizzled out. We saw a lot of coherence around the demand to defund the police this time around. And I think at its best, that was an economic demand, in that people, I think, who carried it to its fullest outcome were calling for, or pointing out the sort of tension in between, especially in New York, we had the defund campaign, it's still active, between giving, billions to the NYPD and at the same time, during the pandemic, laying off sanitation workers and, cutting school budgets and all kinds of stuff. So I think at its best, it was being framed as an economic demand. But I think, I'm an optimist. I think we're moving past the idea that racial justice demands are somehow separate or distinct from, economic demands. I think that we're more class conscious now than we were in the first wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that shapes the things that people were asking for. But like I said in the talk, I think it is our responsibility to think about how a social movement can become an arena for class struggle by framing the demands in those economic terms.
Thank you. And Mia, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready now. It's kind of similar and zooming out a little bit back more into a concept you were touching on for a while. And I'm kind of wondering if you could talk more about, which is, in instances of social movements or some kind of organizing around a particular issue, we've all kind of witnessed instances where despite an issue being widely felt, deeply felt, it doesn't end up taking off the ground, or the reverse with large social movements kind of falling short when it comes to their stated goals, reforms, stuff like that. So I was just wondering if you think, or could talk more about if you think there's something qualitatively different between instances where they are and are not successful, versus, or say a series of protests or a uprising versus a movement, quote unquote. And so you mentioned just now a coherent economic demand as one thing, but is there also external factors that maybe are most important in this case? For example, media amplification, or one single issue that people coalesce around, or a single event triggering something like the murder of George Floyd, or I guess I'll stop there. Is there other factors you're thinking about when distinguishing those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think one way that maybe it's possible to think about it is, a social movement is, composed of ideally millions of people, and for them to remain invested in the social movement, to continue to participate, whether participation, looks like attending protests or then transitioning to other forms of organizing activity, I think they have to believe that there is some kind of outcome that they're going to receive or benefit from, or see some kind of actual meaningful redress to the thing that they are protesting. And I think that is a really deciding factor in whether or not they live or they die. So I think that when it seems like the sort of strands of protests, the expressions of outrage can be sort of gathered up and translated into a wish for something different to happen, something feasible to happen, then that is what makes them continue to be possible. And like I said, I think it's part of the role of organizations to translate that collective rage or grief into some kind of policy program, winnable demand. I mean, like you said, I think we really can't know what's going to start one. I don't know. I mean, we'll be due for another one probably if they keep coming on schedule in the next 3 to 5 years, but we don't know what it's going to be. But I think, we have to be able to react in that way to give people the sense that there is an end and a goal. And I think it also, has a lot to do with the kinds of power that we can gain in the state. That is a huge, will have a huge impact on what we are able to suggest that we can achieve.
Well, the IMF of all people says social uprisings often follow pandemics. So we've got the IMF on our side. Obi, you had a question.
Yes, I have two brief questions. My first one is, would you consider like presidential elections to be a social movement? To give an example, the Bernie Sanders campaign certainly felt like a social movement at the time. There's a lot of engagement, a lot of participation, a lot of education around the policies, etc. So I want to know what's your thoughts on that. The second question I have is, and my apologies for the pedantic formulation, but is there a difference between a social movement and say an uprising? Because the Arab Spring or even Occupy could be considered just uprisings that kind of came up and fizzled out. But we would agree that the civil rights movement was kind of long and drawn out, lasted over some years. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair distinction, and I don't think it's necessarily pedantic to, seek to wring the maximum amount of meaning, specific meaning possible from the terms that we use to refer to the circumstances we find ourselves in. I think that's, totally appropriate. I mean, the term movement, I never really thought about the sort of specifics of this language, but I think the term movement is implying like scale, duration. To me, movement kind of denotes a variety of tactics as well, like in the civil rights movement, and maybe a variety of tactics where I think, uprising, there is this notion of spontaneity, and I think that really does suggest, that the taking of the streets, the rioting. So I would say maybe an uprising is a catalyst to a movement, or an uprising is an element of a movement. But I think it's worthwhile to make a distinction. In response to your other question, I mean, I would agree that I would definitely agree that the Bernie Sanders campaign was a movement, and I think it was a movement insofar as its goals were not simply to get Bernie Sanders elected president of the United States, but its goals were, I think, pretty explicitly to raise class consciousness and to foster a sense of possibility under the conditions that it was taking place in. So I think that is a fair characterization.
Carrington, I believe you were next.
Yeah. Rachel, you'd mentioned how disrupting capital is like a whole other game in the face of globalization. And I just wonder if you have seen any examples of movements that have been able to have an impact at a global scale, or if you've seen any sort of approaches that look promising that you could speak to.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are at a point where consumer boycotts work in pretty limited arenas. This is the opposite of what you're asking, what maybe tactics of economic disruption are less possible or productive. I think for example, right now there's a call for a boycott of Kellogg's products. And I think, within this larger context of the Kellogg's strike, the call for the consumer boycott is effective. So you wouldn't rule it out entirely. During summer 2020, during Black Lives Matter protests, we saw port shutdowns, unionized dock workers shutting down ports, I think for an entire day. I think those are the kind of disruptions of global economic systems that I think have the power to be pretty impactful, and those rely on organized workers, on organized labor. So shipping, supply chains, those are many people would agree that those are critical points of disruption to global capital. Yeah, I mean, if anyone else has additional thoughts on this is not something that I'm 100% and I think super well informed on. So if there are other thoughts, I would love to hear.
Anyone else want to speak before we go to the next question? Okay, David Diaz, I think you're next.
Yeah, I was just wondering what your thoughts are on different types of social movements and their relationship with the elites and the media, for example. So, for example, and how is that related to the success that these movements have in terms of achieving legislative or policy goals? Like, for example, the civil rights movement had, you know, the support of Lyndon Johnson initially in passing the Voting Rights Act. And they, at one point, did have a sympathetic mass media portrayal. And they'd been, you know, working hard for a decade or so, if I recall. Whereas you take a movement or a political party like the Black Panther Party, which was much more radical in its political platform, I would argue, much more militant. And, you know, the response was much more violent, I would say, from the FBI and from the state. So I just wondering if you could comment on sort of this differences in terms of how, what sort of factors, I guess, I'm kind of answering the question myself, I guess, but like, I wonder how do you see this relationship with the elites or certain fragments of the elites or fractions of the elite in terms of achieving success?
Yeah, I mean, I think a mass movement necessarily needs to like interface with political elites, with people who hold elected office, I think, to extract concessions. I think, you know, one of the real powers that the civil rights movement exerted was that they got people in office to do things that they like absolutely did not want to do. Things that they had, you know, other elites telling them not to do. The disruptive power they wielded was so significant that they extracted, you know, concessions that were not desired. And I think today there can sometimes be this, you know, I wouldn't say it's misplaced, but this, I think, no, wise, like it's not a misplaced, it's a wise reluctance to like get too cozy with elites for fear that I think, you know, they'll co-opt our movement. Like, you know, Obama met with all those Black Lives Matter leaders during the first wave of protests. And I think he was actually pretty successful in sort of redirecting, not all, but some of them. But I think that, you know, just because we make a demand of an elite and they grant it, doesn't mean that we like them. It doesn't mean they're our friend. It doesn't even necessarily mean they're our ally. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean we're in coalition with them. It means that they are the person who holds the power to grant the demand that we have. So I think that, you know, that's an orientation to have to people, but, you know, not all of the people who hold elected office are necessarily elite, so they do wield power. I mean, I think in New York City, BSA, we've been able to elect a bunch of like movement politicians, and they are interfacing with like political elites, with other elected officials, with us and for us and on our behalf. So those are relations that we, you know, actively need to develop. I think, you know, the distinction between the civil rights movement and the Black Panthers movement, which, you know, you rightly pointed out, they have, you know, completely different orientations. I would say, like, I would not even necessarily define the organizing of the Black Panthers, you know, as a mass movement. It was like necessarily insular, focused on community, an insular community building strategies, labor that was redirected into community and not necessarily out towards the broader public. I mean, something the civil rights movement accomplished was they had, you know, all kinds of people from different class backgrounds, from different quote unquote racial backgrounds, organizing with them. That was not necessarily the goal of the Black Panther Party.
And if I may, I think the Black Panther Party was more like openly Marxist, I'd say, or anti-capitalist, and into ideological orientation as well.
I think it depends on which phase of the civil rights movement you're looking at. I mean, when it comes to you know, like organizers like A. Philip Randolph, when it comes to the freedom budget. I think those are approaching a more socialistic vision for the demands. I mean, I think a lot of the demands of the civil rights movement were for representation, just representation within excellent systems. And those were not necessarily anti-capitalist demands, but there was significant economic content that I think, falls in line with socialist thinking. I think actually, Black Panthers, there was definitely, Marxist thinking, but also an interest in forms of small business, like what we might think of today as Black capitalism. So I think pulling in both directions there as well.
Franklin Moreno. Someone told me I might have missed your hand being up earlier. Do you feel overlooked?
I'm there. Hey, Rachel. Hey, Mia. How are you guys?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I got one question.
Sure.
Protesters due last year, 2020, in June.
I mean the George Floyd uprisings here in Brooklyn or in New York City?
Yeah, with Brooklyn, of New York. Yeah.
I think one of the reasons we were interested in having this conversation first last summer and now again this winter is because of those protests, because we were really trying to figure out, we're participating in these, like what should we do? How should we relate to them?
Yeah. You have to be careful, people. I'll be honest with you, Rachel. George Floyd died, Rachel.
Yeah, a lot of people. I mean, that's what really launched the movement. A lot of people, filled with rage, with anger, at a system that would allow that to happen.
All right. Well, thank you. I think we have Lee or Nadi next.
Yes. Hey, Rachel, thank you so much. So, I wanted to focus just a little more on, the role of socialist, role specifically of DSA. And, we did have the example of the Black Lives Matter here in New York and in Brooklyn. And I felt there was two things. One was, having the moral high ground. I think that's really important to a successful, a successful mass movement, and that it expands and grows. And we had a situation where, it went on for a very long time and sort of didn't really go anywhere. And like, for instance, in the park over here in Greenpoint, they had silent vigils. I don't know, it was 300 days, something like went on and on and on and on and on. And, it would seem like an organization such as ourselves should have had more of a strategy to help with that, because I think we want people to see organizations that are for fundamental change having the right direction for movements for specific change. And I didn't think we really did that well. I don't know, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do my best. I mean, I've just given a whole talk where I think, one of my main points was that socialists need to intervene in these mass movements in order to direct that energy into winnable demands, clear programs. And yet when it comes down to it on the ground, what exactly does that look like, given the particular climate in which we're in which organizing is so often counterposed to movement politics, in that I remember being in conversations with people in Central Brooklyn, in the racial justice working group where I was active on the Defund NYPD campaign, where people felt extremely strongly that we could not go into protests and have people sign up on mailing lists, and that we could not, go to, we wouldn't have gone to a vigil to make this ask, but like gone into spaces, these sort of more spontaneous spaces, and ask people to volunteer for our city council candidates, even though those candidates were, running on defund platforms. There was this hesitation, I think, that emerges from the fear that, that then becomes, transactional, or that then itself might be seen as a co-optation. And, one of the circumstances that we have to deal with is that I think a critique of NYCDSA, and I think it's a misplaced critique, and I think it's like a bad faith critique, when it is deployed as a critique of our organizing work, is that DSA is a like white organization, or like an organization of college graduates. And for that reason, there's this sense that it's somehow unacceptable for us to be in movement spaces as organizers if we're trying to co-opt them or trying to redirect them or subvert them. And obviously, I think that's incredibly wrong-headed and dangerous, but it does, I think, speak more fundamentally to some kind of disconnect that we're working in right now between the organized left, which we are, and the working class in the city, which is who was participating in these massive protests very clearly. So the fact that it is seen as somehow, unacceptable or not quite right for us to be doing stuff like that, I think just tells us we need to do more to bridge that gap. And I think, one of the ways that we are doing that, I think we are successfully bridging the gap by delivering on some of our promises, by getting socialists in office who deliver material gains, by sort of showing up in communities as organizers, following up with people, now providing constituent services, making sure our presence as DSA is out there. I think we can bridge this gap, but I think that, until we do that more successfully, it's actually going to be pretty hard. And I think this is like, this is like a historic socialist problem. Like there's many examples of like socialist organizations, like, in the United States and Russia, showing up in a community and being like, hey, like we're here, work with us. And people are like, absolutely not. Like, who are you guys? Like the going to the villages. People are like, what on earth, though? So I think, it's a historic problem and not a brand new problem, but we do need to contend with it by rooting ourselves in the places we are and letting it be known that, we do work, we deliver on our promises, and, we're the real deal. So.
We have one question in the stack, and if anyone else wants to ask one, please get in the stack. Mia.
Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to ask kind of broadly if you could talk about like the things we've been discussing in the context of the Columbia strike. I feel like that would be important to bring up, maybe given that it's been so successful in scaling up and out and like getting outside community support, and it seems like there's been a lot of like just building up with that strike. And some questions I'm thinking about is like how these dynamics that we've been talking about this whole session relate or maybe differ within campus organizing specifically, because you're organizing against school administration, where, you're potentially disrupting classes and like class schedule as a way of collective action. And also, maybe to what extent, and I don't know, whatever you feel comfortable commenting on in terms of like what other outside groups have been helping, like to what extent that's been important or helpful in scaling up this like strike operation.
Yeah, sure. Like I said at the beginning, I am on strike. I've been on strike for like 6 weeks, striking for our first contract as student workers of Columbia. Columbia is kind of important in the graduate labor struggle because it was an NLRB decision in 2016 that granted graduate student workers and all student workers at private universities the right to organize into unions. And so I think one way we think about our strike is that it really, because we set this recognition precedent, our first contract also sets a precedent for fair compensation at graduate schools across the country, which is why we are really hanging on for what we think of as a just first contract. At the same time, our strike is the largest strike in the nation right now. We're a 3,500 member unit, although not all of us are on strike. There's been some attrition, but at the same time, we are. I will always say the graduate student workers are workers, but we are a different kind of workers than other workers, and I think that distinction informs some of the organizing that we have to do on campus. Some of the coalitions we've tried to build are, asserting this idea that Columbia is not just our employer, but Columbia is also, the largest, one of the largest landlords in Manhattan. I think maybe the largest landlord in Manhattan, owns massive portfolios of property up in Morningside Heights, and is therefore one of the largest drivers of displacement in those neighborhoods. And so working with anti-gentrification groups, trying to sort of assert the interconnectedness of the struggle against Columbia as an employer and the struggle against Columbia as a landlord, as a real estate magnate. That's been something we've been trying to get into and activate. And we have seen anti-gentrification organizers on our picket line, which is amazing. It's also been really powerful to be in coalition with our city's other unions. Like, we've had tons of Teamster presence on our picket lines. The Teamsters lent us their inflatable cat, which is like, it's like a big cat holding a big sack of money. And because it's a UPS local, it's like strangling a UPS worker, which is like, in the brown uniform. And we don't wear the same uniform, obviously, but it's been really wonderful to have that loan to us. I think something else that we're trying to really fight for is full recognition of our unit. That's super important to our unit. What that means is that Columbia really wants to exclude hourly workers in the master's students and among undergraduate students, and we really want our union to include those workers, because we think if Columbia cuts them out, then hardly any other schools will get to keep them in, and we might never be able to renegotiate a contract to include them. So fighting for recognition, not just of like PhD students, but undergraduate students and master's students, is really important to us, and we think it's like precedent setting. So we really, I don't know if we'll win it, but we're really trying to. So I think those are some of the sort of points of the strike. I mean, it's tough to strike on a campus because people are like upset. Like, if they can't go to class, they're angry. We had a big campus shutdown, big picket. People were, not all, but some people were very unpleased. And there's the idea like, why are you stopping me from going in? Like, why would you disrupt my education like this? And I think, what we really try is like, it's not about you. It's about like disrupting business as usual in the university. Like, we're not trying to harm you. We're not trying to inconvenience you. It's just like, we're trying to exert this sort of structural leverage against Columbia. But it's been really sad to not teach students and, suggest to students that they should have come to class because it's crossing our picket. That's been really tough.
Okay, we have two more questions to the stack, and I think that'll take us up to closing time. So these will be the last two. David Diaz.
Any thoughts on the PRO Act and how consequential that could be, I guess, for union organizing? I mean, unlikely to happen, I suppose, but surprised that I haven't seen it more on DSA as a potential area of interest, I guess, for political action.
Yeah, I hate to say it, I'm actually a little lost in the PRO Act timeline. We had a big campaign over the summer trying to flip legislators and successfully flipped a couple of major ones to support the PRO Act, but I don't really know what has happened in that campaign since then. I mean, I think, what I think was really amazing about our PRO Act campaign is that it was able to really thread the needle really nicely between labor organizing and the fight for a Green New Deal. And I think like that is the needle we need to be threading, like, class-wide demands that will preserve a livable future for all of us, are possible through a strong labor movement and not without it. But if there are any organizers on the call who have any like updates on DSA's PRO-ACT campaign, please share them, because I feel like I'm not fully looped in.
Okay, and Jay, I think you have the last question.
Yeah, Rachel, you mentioned very interestingly that Columbia also is a major landlord in the area. And so that kind of is relevant for Piven's strategic discussion about connecting with those in other interdependent relationships. So you're in a strike, the employer capitalist relationship, but you could strengthen your relationship, your strike, by align with the tenants of Columbia. And I'm in a similar situation at CUNY where I'm part of a tendency that's argued we need to raise common demands with the students, that we need to, strike over our working conditions of salary, but raise, free tuition, housing, other demands that meet our students, which our bureaucrats are vehemently against because they play by the rules, which Piven says you have to break to make any advances. So in the Columbia strike, I didn't know if this has ever been raised to expand the demands to include, around the tenant struggles, the anti-gentrification demands against Columbia.
Yeah, this is a great question. So we have been fighting for this first contract for a long time, like basically since 2016. And in the earlier stages of our contract campaign, we were and did include in our package some of these demands that exceeded the scope of graduate student compensation, benefits, and unit recognition. Some of the demands were like Columbia campus should be sanctuary campus. Columbia needs to sever all relationships with the NYPD, and did extend into some of this, like, this is before I started there, I'm only a second year, but as I understand it, did extend into like Columbia's relationship with, as a landlord. A lot of those demands came out of our contract because it became clear that Columbia would never ever move on them. And it seemed, and I think unfortunately this was a correct assessment, that by continuing to include them, we were undermining ourselves in the fight for a first contract. But I don't think those things are off the table for the future. I think that like once we have our contract, once we have recognition as a unit, then we can continue to like exercise our disruptive power in the university and win some of those concessions. And I think this is, I'm not just saying this optimistically, like NYU, which has been organized as a graduate student union for much longer than us, for like 15 or 20 years or something, did recently, I think, win concessions in the area of NYU severing ties with the NYPD. So I think that like it's labor organizing is a very long-term goal, and like why we're building up unions now, why we're like, doing the labor movement and stuff, is so that unions can become political actors once more and exercise their power in those arenas. So like I think it was a really difficult pill to swallow, that like we couldn't, keep these demands in our first contract, but I do think that they were unwinnable. And I hope that we can return to them once we do have our contract.
All right, thank you. Excellent presentation. And I think, Karen, you're going to take it out from here.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming out. And this is our final class of the fall. We'll be starting up again in the spring, but Mia is going to take us out with announcements. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Rachel, again. And if you'd like to plug any like Columbia strike related links or anything else, please do so in the chat. We'd love to see the strike fund or anything else that we can do to support. And for other announcements, we kind of like similar to a school or university schedule, we'll be having a January session in between our 2 semesters. So this fall semester that's ending and the spring semester that will be starting up in February. We're going to be doing a January Lenin session. This is going to be kind of a tighter knit in-person reading group style situation where we're going to be reading State and Revolution, Imperialism, The Highest Stages of Capitalism, and others. We're working on the syllabus for that right now. And that's going to be on Saturdays in the afternoon for 4 sessions in a row. So there is a Google form you can fill out if you're interested. We're trying to gauge interest for that. And like I said, our next semester will be starting up straight off the bat with the beginning of February on February 1st. And keep an eye out for RSVP links for that. We're excited to see you guys back for spring semester. And North Brooklyn is going to be having a social and a fundraiser for Teamster, United Metro Energy workers who are currently on strike as well right now. And the fundraiser / NBK social will be at Our Wicked Lady in Bushwick on December 17th, so in a few days at 6 p.m. And you can RSVP on Facebook to that. And there is also a strike fund for the Teamsters. We're trying to raise funds for them because they've been on strike for almost 8 months now, I think. So they've been out there for a long time and definitely need our support. And in terms of other ways to support, you can come in person to their picket line every single Tuesday, 7 to 10 a.m. in the morning in Greenpoint at 500 Kingsland Ave. I've been out there several times. It's really great energy, and we could always use more people for that. So please do come out if you have your Tuesday mornings available at any point. And please join DSA. If you are not a member already, dues keep our work sustainable and running for the future. So we're trying to hit 100K as well. Please join. Carrington is dropping the link for that. And lastly, if you have any questions for the political ed committee, any suggestions, any feedback, you can always email us at nbk.poly.ed@socialists.nyc.
Thank you, Mia, and thanks again, everybody. Hopefully we'll see you in January, if not then in February, and wishing everyone a safe and happy holiday. Thank you, Rachel. Have a great trip tomorrow. And I think you said it was your mom's birthday. Wish her happy birthday from North Brooklyn Political Ed.
I will.
Okay, we hope to see you again soon. Bye, everybody. Good night.
Good night, everyone.